I'm John Edmonds, and providing I can get up, I'll start the proceedings. I chair the Trade Union and Employment Forum of the History and Policy Initiative, and we are sponsoring this event. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but that's what we're using for the moment. We're here to relaunch this book, Change in Trade Unions. It was first published in 1981, and it examines trade unions in very detailed aspects in the 60s and 70s. And in my view, and this is the moment I think to nail colours to the mast, I think it's the most important work on that period of trade union history. So, in sending me the book, you did a good thing, thank you. The book, as you know, has 4 authors. Unfortunately, Roger Undy and Bill McCarthy are no longer with us, but the other 2 authors, Valerie Ellis and Tony Halmos, are with us and will be telling us about the book and introduce the various themes and the various aspects of it. Valerie has had a distinguished career, both in the trade union movement, Assistant General Secretary of IPCS, and academic work in Ruskin and in Goldsmiths. Tony has had a varied career, private joke, and worked for the TUC, and subsequently worked for the City of London Corporation, and that's a big stretch if you think about it, TUC to the City of London. And he has brought together, I think, most of us who are celebrating this book and relaunching it. And Tony, many thanks for that. Tony will speak first, and then Valerie will speak, and then Peter, who's alongside me, after that. I'll introduce Peter after our 2 colleagues have spoken, and then afterwards I will lead into a discussion session and make my own few comments. Sorry, delete few, make my own comments. So over to Tony, our first speaker. Tony, your hands.
Thank you very much, John. Firstly, could I say anyone wants some refreshment that while they're sitting there listening, there's water at the back, but sadly nothing stronger. So do feel free to go and get a glass, and certainly at the end, of course, you can. Secondly, just on the mechanics of the book reappearing, this of course was the original back in 1981, and back end of last year, literally actually in December, Radley, who are now the publishers, and Hutchison were the original publishers, Radley came over and they produced this new version. In part of what they call Radley Library Editions, the trade unions. So that's the. And if you want to either buy a copy of the new version, or probably given the price tag on it, which I hardly dare give you the figure, it's not exactly $9.99 in all the bookstores. Nonetheless, there is a 20% discount for a while with a piece of paper from the publishers sitting at the back next to the water. So when you go, in particular, if you're in the institution with a library, you want to persuade them to buy it, that sort of thing. That is sitting at the back next to the water. Right, what's the origin of this first? I'm asked to cover that, and then some about what's in here. It was set up at what was then called the Oxford Centre for Management Studies, which is now part of the Science Business School at Oxford, in 1972. So it has to be said, kicking off, it's a very long time ago. It was set up with a grant from the government's Department of Employment, as it was then called, And it was created and managed overall by Bill McCarthy, who a number of people in this room will know exactly what I mean, one or two might not, but Bill was very much the leading active researcher and teacher of industrial relations in Oxford in that period. And he had a research team which obviously included Valerie, Ellis and myself, and Roger Unding. And it has to be said also at this stage that Roger very much did the heavy lifting, as I call it, to turn all the research that we did into this 353-page book. And so it has to be acknowledged that that was his key role, and in relation to the others, including, as we said, Bill McCarthy, who was, I think that's in the way of these things, that's why the authors are listed in the way that they are. The book was, of course, originally published in 1981, and he was therefore very much the lead author. As John has said, Roger sadly died just last year, and the decision by the publishers to republish it, which today's event marks, came just afterwards, almost certainly coincidentally, but at least I'm aware that they were conscious of Roger's sad death. Therefore, today is also a memorial to Roger, and those of us who knew him or came across him, this is from his funeral last year, just a picture of him there, just to show you what we're talking about. Very pleased that just came in and joined us. Tell me if I got this wrong, but his wife Claire and one of his daughters Kim are also with us today, which we're delighted about. How did we run the project? Well, Roger and Val, correct me if I'm wrong again, Val, but you joined the research team in 1972 and I did in 1973. So 1973, literally 50 years ago this year. Which makes me shudder every time I say that. The core of the work was a series of very detailed case studies on the individual unions which we decided to cover, which was around 15 of them. And they were done in slightly different ways, but that's the gist of it. And I first worked on the GMW, as it was then called, now in effect the GMB, and then on what was then the TGW, which was now part of Unite. The work combined lots of research in union papers and archives, and many interviews with senior officials across the country. And I'm sure I interviewed John at some point, but neither of us can actually remember the event. It's such a long time ago. It primarily covered the period 1960 to 1975. It needs to be understood. Even though the book didn't appear on bookshelves, in bookshops or whatever, until 1981, it really covered the 60s, 75. And that needs to be understood when we think about the issues that were going on in the second half of the 70s in relation to trade unions and industrial relations. We invariably had unlimited access to the unions we covered, and that was mainly through Bill McCarthy's close links with so many union leaders. Preparing for today has certainly been a trip down memory lane, the wider economy and politics of the period for sure, but also the many now non-existent union names. Look at the list of abbreviations at the beginning of the book, for example. Just 4 out of the 87 unions or union organisations listed, such as the TUC, still exist with the same name, just 4, which, until I counted it up, I hadn't realised quite so much. It's quite so much change. I don't know, obviously, wherever it's changed. So what did the research find out? Now, in 2 or 3 minutes, to summarise 4 years of research and 353 pages of the book, quite a feat, so I'm bound to miss stacks out. But let's make a start of it. The top line was clear. Union leaders had far more discretion in the period studied, or all of this relates to the period studied, obviously. Union leaders had far more discretion to shape their unions as they wish than almost all the then research had up to that point said. The level of discretion to make changes obviously varies across unions, across time, across differing areas of change. Thus, a major part of the study is the analysis of the external versus internal, what we call change agents. At that time, this was a major research issue in the IR field, so it was very much in line with what people wanted to know more about it. And hence, dare I say, in that sense, in the academic sense, the research. I should say in passing that the decision by, going back to what I mentioned earlier, the decision by the Department of Employment in 1972 to fund the research stemmed fundamentally from the fact, of course, there had been the 1971 Industrial Relations Act, and the civil servants who ran the Research and Planning Division at the Department of Employment wanted to get much more of a handle on what exactly made unions change and grow and decline and all the rest of it, which of course is, you might say, a bit of a cart before horse, but that's classic of civil service on the one hand and politicians on the other. But there we are. It's quite an interesting fact that the Industrial Relations Act was on the statute book, and then they did the research to find out what it might mean. Whether the book, when it appeared in 1981, answered that question is another matter. The world had moved on, so probably not. Whether the private research papers that we did, the case studies that we prepared, that they basically had commissioned, whether they were helpful, which even then they weren't appearing until 74, 75, 76. You can see the world had moved on already, so that's how these things happen. And indeed, if you read the book either a long time ago or recently, you'll see that it there's only the odd paragraph which says basically the Dutch Relations Act didn't have much effect on the issues covered in the book. I think the key quote summarising what I just said about the focus of the study is on page 326. It says, all in all, it seems to us that one of the central conclusions to emerge from this study is that so far as change is concerned, a very great deal depends on the attitudes, objectives and calibre of General Secretaries or their equivalents. Thus, the research tries to determine how change happened in different unions and why, and what were these changes. It does not come up with a set of changes for each and every union, covering everybody in a unitary way. It has a model of change to try and understand the process that determines it, on page 28, one wonderful graph, and which looks at how change takes place and existing leadership and policies and causes of change, and agents and areas of change. That's all covered. The three main areas of change that it looks at are firstly union government, secondly what's called in this field job territories, which is who the union organises in which sectors, and third what's called job regulation, which is primarily collective bargaining. Union government looks at centralised or decentralised, diffused or concentrated, and then whether there's a difference between how the government of the union works in what are called collective bargaining areas on the one hand, and non-collective bargaining other issues, which there are many, of course, running the organisation. And there are quite a lot of differences. A number of unions in that period where there were differences, so it was worth splitting it in that way. Job territories is both natural change, mostly in that period growth, but not all, and subsequently, of course, very different. We'll come to that later. And mergers, obviously, between unions. And the third one, job regulation, which is mainly almost entirely about collective bargaining, not exclusively. Levels of militancy, how union decisions are made in the collective bargaining process, by whom and at what level. So just quickly running through some of the findings in each of those areas. Union government in the non-bargaining area, you had very centralised, up and down from the national level, if you like, to the local level. You had very centralised unions like the TGW, and very decentralised unions like the engineers and the then public employees, National Union of Public Employees. And then what's called the horizontal axis, or diffused, so even at each level. So nationally you have one General Secretary, all powerful, all in charge, or of course much more diffused General Secretary, committee for this, someone president over there, etc., etc. And you had diffused unions, the engineers very much in the diffused category, NALGO and the MUT likewise, and the TGW and a couple of other unions, particularly in the study, are very concentrated. And then on the bargaining side, decentralised process, very strongly the Transport General Workers Union, and more centralising in UCAT and the NUM in those days, interestingly enough. Job territories, the natural growth, natural change, big change of the ASTMS as was, and the TGW. Interesting in John's old union, the differences between the different regions, which you would be probably more familiar with than I am. But nonetheless, that was the big thing came out of my work on the GMW, that how regional it was, and some of these variations were different from one region to another. And of course, you had membership decline, and even then in the mining sector, as we know. And mergers, you had three groups. You had aggressive unions really out there trying to merge with others, transport workers, ASTMS, those that were consolidating, coming together because it was sensible to do so, engineers being the most prominent, and you had what you might call defensive. They had to merge with somebody because of the guiding existence. That's the big, massive, very small unions that were merging all the time with the bigger ones. And then last on job regulation, i.e. mostly collective bargaining, the main themes here, the rise of militancy, rank and file, how different unions then managed that, and the impact it had on them. The changes in the level at which bargaining took place, so national, local, regional, and so on, big issue at that time. And then later, closer to that, of course, the involvement of lay shop stewards on the one hand, and with members as a whole, as against full-time officials. So, in conclusion, I would say that the book provides a detailed historical snapshot of what happened in UK unions in the period studied, 60 to 75. It also provides an analytical framework for how change took place, at least at that time. There are a couple of omissions, interesting enough, rereading it recently, for tonight's event. I was struck by the almost complete absence of the role of unions in politics and how that may be another area of change. Maybe not so much change in that period, but hence its absence possibly. I can't remember, I put it that way. I don't remember because I probably wasn't there right at the beginning when it was done. But I can guess, given, as I said, who was funding the project, I don't think they were overexcited about the detail of relations between the unions and the Labour Party. It's a funny suspicion. That might have been the reason, but I may be wrong. We will never know. That was quite interesting. The other omission, more straightforwardly, was, given the stress on the role of union leaders, there's very little, if any, description of the differing backgrounds, views and approaches of the individuals concerned. But that's understandable, because that sounds like a whole stack of biographies of union general secretaries, and I'm not sure that would mean another whole book almost. So I can see the logic of that. And also given the approach, the fundamental sort of thesis about the book, it wouldn't have necessarily added much to that. I can see that argument. I'll leave to Val, who follows me in a moment, whether the analytical framework for changing trade unions in the UK, which the study provided, still holds 50 years later, or nearly 50 years later. She's going to pick up where the book leaves off, as well as have a look a bit at some of the issues I've raised. What does the analysis the book contains say about the future changes in British trade unions from the 1980s onwards? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to basically look at the differences between the situation today and the situation as it was in 1979, which is when the book was first written. In 1979, when the book was written, unions were at the height of their power and influence. Although at the moment we might seem to be going through a repeat of the winter of discontent, which was happening in 79, the underlying situation is very different. In terms of membership, there's been a massive decline in trade union membership in the years between 1979 and now. In 1979, there were 13.2 million trade union members. In 2022, that had reduced to 6.6 million. And the majority of the members today are in the public sector and are women. Women now account for 57% of the total members. In 1974, they were 25%. This is not because men have become more hostile to unions, as far as we know. So I don't think anybody's actually looked at that. But because increased levels of education and hence more skilled professional occupations among women, an increased rate of full-time working, women shifting to unionised occupations, while men were shifting to non-unionised areas such as IT. And women are a higher percentage of public sector employment, which has itself been expanding. At this point, it's also worth observing that the number of women trade union leaders now roughly reflects, and perhaps some might say even over-reflects, their position in membership. This certainly wasn't always the case. Indeed, I spent a considerable amount of time as a woman full-time officer in my own union on campaigning to secure much better representation of women in the leadership of the unions. But we now have Sharon Graham as the General Secretary of Unite, Christine McAnee, Unison, Pat Cullen at RCN, Joe Grady at the University of UCU, and Mary Bousted, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. And of course, until recently, Frances O'Grady as General Secretary of the TUC. As for the growth in the public sector now accounts for 2/3 of trade union membership. 50% of public sector workers are unionised, while only 13% in the private sector are. Although even in the public sector, union density has fallen slightly since 1995. The number of unions has also changed through mergers. 24 unions in table 2 in this book are now reduced to 11. Of these, only 3 are purely manual unions, the NUR, the NUM and the Bakers Union. 2 are purely white collar, CPSA now, part of PCS, Public Services Union, and Newby. And 6 are both white collar and manual. GMB, USDOR, Communication Workers Union, Unite, Unison, and the Iron Steel Trades Community. Royal College of Nursing doesn't appear in the book at all. It was only registered as a trade union under the Industrial Relations Act in 1977. But today, it's the 4th largest union after Unison, Unite, and GMB. So quite a change in the union situation. A major theme of the book that in responding to the challenge in the external environment, the choice of alternative responses between unions in similar situations can be largely attributed to the philosophies, objectives and national leaders. As we know, the challenge facing trade unions is that the Conservative government has been restraining pay in the public sector over the last 10 years or so, creating a build-up of discontent among public sector workers. This was exacerbated by the strain put on the health sector and other emergency public services by the pandemic. Their efforts were rewarded by pay offers well below private sector comparators and expected inflation. The refusal to negotiate by the government has resulted in unprecedented strike action by the Royal College of Nursing and the GMB. Clearly, the members had the motivation to take industrial action in the face of a refusal to negotiate by the government. But it could also be argued that it was an important factor that both unions involved, the RCN and the GMB, had recent changes of leadership. The background of both these leaders suggests that they were much more receptive to the idea of industrial action and have the character and experience to be able to mobilise the members as required. Indeed, it may well be the case that they were elected by the members in preference to others for that very reason. Yeah, I think I must have come to the end, but it seems to be quite what I thought. Yeah, sorry about that.
Thanks, Valerie. Can I now introduce Peter Ackers? As many of you will know, he is the Emeritus Professor in the History of Industrial Relations at Loughborough University, industrial relations expert, and written extensively on the Oxford School, and is an expert on the work of Hugh Clegg in particular. Peter.
Thank you very much. How do I bring my, I need to click on that.
Do you want to change places? Would that be easiest?
No, I'll stand up if I can get
Or move them out so there you go. What's happening?
right, the full slide. Where's the... I'm all right over here, John. Where's the full slide? Can you see it?
No.
Slide shine. There you go. Oh, that's all right anyway. Right, well, thanks very much. I want to look at the academic context of when the book came out. And the subtitle I've put is The Oxford School, a turning point in British industrial relations. These things are always personally interesting because in 1981 I'd just finished my MA in Industrial Relations at Warwick University. Entering the field at its height really when it was a very popular, influential public policy sort of field. And I'd also just moved from Oxford. So I had two of the people mentioned here. Bill McCarthy, I went to a seminar in 1979. Bill McCarthy was speaking. And Rod Martin was one of my tutors on several courses at Oxford. So in retrospect, I had sort of connections with these sort of things. Can we just move it on?
Yeah.
No. I think you press the thing on there. Isn't it just the...
This one?
Yeah, I think so.
Nice.
Yeah. Just to say a little bit about the Oxford group, it was described as the New Oxford Group by Jeremy Boogler in New Society, which was then a popular sort of social science publication, which has now disappeared, in the 14th of February 1968, which is, he kind of caught the Oxford School at its public policy high point, in a sense, when it was the most influential. And the reason it was influential was that this report, the Royal Commission on Trade Unions and Employers Associations, had just been concluded, on which top people from the CBI, TUC, but also Hugh Clegg sat, along with Otto Confreud. And the Donovan project, that was, Clegg actually drafted the first version of this report. And the Donovan project that came out of that was to reform voluntary collective bargaining, to try and avoid legal regulation, to try and avoid things like the 1971 Industrial Relations Act. The idea was that employers and trade unions could reform industrial relations and make it work better. And obviously the issues at the time were strikes, unofficial strikes, inflation, and restrictive practices. And the idea was to develop a form of productivity bargaining in the workplace that would start to grapple with these types of problems. The Labour governments of that time wasn't comfortable. That was proactive enough. It's quite a long-term strategy. And so in 1969, the white paper In Place of Strife came out. And again, the Oxford School's influential here, because Bill McCarthy, who had been the director of research on the Donovan research programme, then drafted In Place of Strife. And then what followed, I mean, obviously In Place of Strife failed, it was rejected by the trade unions, and then the Labour government was defeated. And then what followed was the Industrial Relations Act, which was failed. And then what followed by that was the social contract and the attempt to build a voluntary incomes policy working with the trade unions. And so, for instance, my guy, who I've just finished the first draft of my biography of, Hugh Clegg, his 1979 book, The Changing System of Industrial Relations, is still fairly optimistic that this social contract will work. And you know, there's still a fair amount of optimism that there are solutions to these types of problems.
So you
Yeah.
we're all getting
So if you go back to the Bugler article, it names 5 men, and they're all men. It's a very male field in those days. As you say, you know, the trade unions are very male, industrial relations is very male. Names 5 men, but when he writes in 1968, he's not writing at the beginning, he's in a sense writing at a dividing point. The beginning was about 1949, when Hugh Clegg and Alan Flanders both arrived at Oxford as a lecturer in industrial relations and a fellow at Nuffield College. By 1968, the group's starting to separate into 2 parts, really. Well, not really, into 2 parts. So it's dividing into a Warwick and Oxford centres as Clegg leaves to form the Industrial Relations Research Unit at Warwick University, the brand new Warwick University. So Clegg's one of the sort of foundation professors at the new Warwick University. And so what you get then is 2 streams, really. You get going to Warwick, you've got Clegg, who's the key player. Alan Flanders follows him shortly, a few years later, but I think like 72 or something like that. Then he dies shortly after that, so he dies in 73. But also a lot of other people coming from Oxford. George Bain, who later becomes head of the Industrial Relations Research Unit and head of the London Business School. Willie Brown, who becomes Professor of Industrial Relations at Cambridge. Richard Hyman, who's the best-known Marxist. And they're all students of Clegg and Flanders, and they follow them up to Oxford. But there's still a substantial group that remain in Oxford. Bill McCarthy is the best known. Alan Fox is a very interesting character. He's much less involved in policies, and he's sort of a founding figure in industrial sociology. And he doesn't really get involved in a lot of this more hands-on type stuff. Arthur Marsh is another important figure. I'd be interested if you can remember him, but I mean, he like Bill McCarthy, what was distinctive about Arthur Marsh, which made the Oxford School so potent to begin with, was to have terrifically good contacts with shop stewards in the local car factories and stuff, and that's where McCarthy and Marsh really start to distinguish themselves from industrial relations in other parts of the country. And then you've got other people like Derek Robinson, the economist. These are the next generation coming down. Derek Robinson, the economist. Rod Martin, as I say, who taught me, a sort of industrial sociologist who stayed at Oxford and worked quite a bit with Roger Undy. So some of the later books by Roger Undy are with Rod Martin. So this is the sort of background to it. So what does this book represent in terms of this story? I think the first thing it represents is the sort of academic IR's new empirical social science. So to start with, industrial relations is quite it's not a very systematic field. It's very heavily involved in public policy proposals and stuff, and quite individualistic. But from the mid-70s onwards, particularly at Warwick, where Clegg gets SSRC funding for the Industrial Relations Research Unit, it starts to become more of a sort of solid social science type field. And I think this book, to some extent, reflects that turn. So the book has no strong public policy agenda. It's not laying down a new solution. And I think in some ways that's a weakness of the book at this point. You know, you're thinking, this is just before they fall off the edge, and yet there's no real sort of strategy. Yeah, there's no, you know, where's the strategy that's going to bring Britain into a sort of Swedish type trajectory with strong trade unions and high productivity and all that sort of stuff. It's also, it's a looking back book, and that's, I think, it'll be very, very useful for historians, because I feel so many young historians nowadays have no sense of what an engineering shop steward is or any of those sort of things. I think the book will be terrifically useful for that type of thing. Although it tends to see the spread of collective bargaining, the growth of union membership and union mergers, tend to see it sort of carrying on as normal into the future. And that is true of almost all the industrial relations period of that time. So as I say, when I arrived at Warwick in 1918, there was very little sense that the ground was moving underneath your feet. It also anticipates Roger Undy's later work, important work on new trade union mergers, and the book's heated in that because a lot of the book is about mergers. It's not, in a sense, it's not a complacent book. It's not saying, oh, things are great or anything like that. It says, for instance, that there's more problems than opportunities for trade unions. But also sees trade unions as survivors and expects 1970s industrial relations to carry on into the future. And most of the books that I've read of this time from industrial relations people, there is a sense of industrial relations having a bit of a group think at this time, because the Thatcherite right is gathering influence at this time, but they're kind of ignoring it, so they're all talking to each other really, I think. And so there is a sense that they expect industrial relations to continue into the 1980s with more militancy, more shop stewards, more incomes policy, and all these things obviously disappear. And this is from Marsh's book, and it is a remarkable tipping point. 79, everything peaks in 79. So 79 in hindsight is a remarkable historic. If you're a historian and you like turning points as I do, 79 is such a neat and tidy turning point. It really is quite dramatic. In politically, industrial relations. So sometimes it's hard to fit the turning points together. You might have a different turning point in social history to the one in political history, but in this instance, 79 is such a sharp turning point. Oh, again, it didn't appear like that at the time. I mean, Jim Pryor was the employment secretary at the time. He didn't look like he was going to change very much and stuff like that. So, in this sense, any study of trade unions and industrial relations in the 70s is a very poor guide to the future, and the future were all sorts of things that people hadn't really thought about much, like business schools and employee involvement and human resource management, and all this language that I grew up with in my career had barely established itself in Britain. Sharp decline in union membership, very sharp decline in collective bargaining. It's worth saying also a very sharp decline in strikes, because I mean, academics loved strikes. You know, it might have been bad. It might have been bad for Britain, but industrial relations academics loved strikes. About half, you know, the average industrial relations textbook of that era, about half the book was on strikes. You know, there were people developed their whole careers around studying strikes. So, in a strange way, academic industrial relations benefited from industrial relations chaos. So it is quite a remarkable turning point. I take the point that Tony made that actually the book does give more agency to trade unions than a lot of people, and particularly my guy Hugh Clegg wrote a book on trade unions under collective bargaining, I think it was called 1976, where he's tended to suggest that basically collective bargaining drove union memberships, that trade unions were very passive organisations driven by decisions made about collective bargaining, primarily by employers and the state and stuff like that. Whereas this book does actually suggest that trade unions have some agency. Having said that, it doesn't really give any sense of how the trade union movement overall could deal with this situation. It doesn't have a sense of impending crisis, if you like. And I think I'll stop there.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Well, as Peter and others have said, of course, this deals with the trade union movement before what Peter kindly called the turning point. I've heard it called other things, but that was the turning point. I remember it very well. In 1978, my union, the GMW, as it then was preparing a lot of celebration to welcome our millionth member. We were pretty close, it was irresistible, we were going to get there. We knew almost the week we were going to get there. The T&G was characteristically congratulating itself on having reached 2 million members, and then of course things changed. I don't think we fell off a cliff, I think we were pushed off a cliff, but then of course GMW never reached 1 million. T&G quickly lost membership and went well below 2 million. So that was the change and that was the turning point. So the book was written about different times. And I'm not going to deal with it as a historical record. It's very important for that, as Peter, well, all our speakers have said. I'm going to deal with it in as far as it provides some insights, some lessons, some warnings even, that might be used by trade unions in the future. Now the first point is a point that has been made several times already, but since it's a central point of the book, I'm going to refresh it and repeat it. And that is the question of agency. When I was a young trade union official, and I was once, Jack Cooper, the GMW's then General Secretary, told a bunch of us, I think there was a slight defensiveness about this explanation, but anyway, he said that trade union membership was driven by the economic circumstances of the country. Putting it briefly, he said, when employment went up, our membership went up. When unemployment went up, our membership went down. Well, I have to say, even I, as a young official, didn't believe that that was an adequate explanation even then. And later, when George Bain wrapped it up in rather better academic language, I still didn't believe it. And the major advance caused by this book is that it junked the idea that trade unions are, if you like, in little boats being pushed around by choppy seas. We have agency, and as the book demonstrates, and as I might demonstrate in a few examples, trade unions can make their own future. They're not passive, they can do things. Sometimes they are passive, and that's a great mistake. So that's the first lesson from this book, and it's a very important lesson. But of course the subsequent question is, okay, if trade unions have agency, they have the power to change the prospects of the particular union they're in, how do they go about it? Because that's the next major question. Agency is great, but using it effectively is much, much better. I think it's pretty clear. First of all, a union has to decide what its objective is. Is it going for stability? Is it going for growth? Is it going to try and be an industrial union dominating a sector? What is it? What is the objective of the union? And then the key point is, to achieve success, you stick to that objective, but you also design your structure and your strategy around it. You know what you want and you aim to deliver it, and that is extraordinarily difficult. But that is the not very well concealed, I suppose, key to the future. Some examples. The book indicates, absolutely correctly, that the T&G and ASDMS decided to go for rapid growth. That's what they wanted to, that's before Jack Jones, they decided to go for rapid growth. And in order to get that rapid growth, they had to find the best structure to deliver it. And they soon discovered, the T&G certainly discovered, by experience, that having a centralised organisation where decisions were made in, well, general councils, executives, finance committees and so on, wasn't the best way to recruit new members. And so, in my view, the ASDMS almost by accident, and the T&G by design, decided to make sure that they were relying on local representatives, local activists, to do the recruiting. And the role of the trade union was to back them in doing that. Not to direct them in very precise, no right micromanagement here. Give them the support. And then, of course, it was discovered that the buggers wouldn't do it unless they were given power and authority. So the next stage was to make sure the local activists had power and authority. But then it worked. They also discovered, of course, that a good way to grow, not a big secret, was through mergers with other unions. And here the penny dropped rather more slowly, but it was an important conclusion. Local activists, while they may recruit members, showed very little enthusiasm for mergers and amalgamations. For them, it was just an extra painful episode. They'll look after their own members, they'll recruit new members that were like the ones they've already got, but mergers, that was, as we would say now, above their pay grade, and it was frankly outside their competence and power. So the second thing that you needed if you were going to go for rapid growth is that your general secretary or general president, whoever the most important person was, should have the power and authority to negotiate mergers with more or less a free hand and to carry those mergers through. And both the unions did that. Jack Jones, Clive Jenkins did that. They both set off on mergers. Harry Irwin for a bit from the T&G, but the senior people, they were going for the mergers, and the recruitment and the merger they were amazingly successful in creating rapid growth. Over 10 years, the T&G increased their membership by nearly 80%. The ASTMS, from of course a lower base, smaller base, increased their membership by 400%. So if you wanted to know how to do it, then you follow the example of those two unions. Another group of unions mentioned in the book are the major public service unions, now go UP, COSI, as they were. They were more discriminating, if I can put it this way. None of them wanted to push out into new businesses and services, but what they did want to do is to have more members and be more important in the sectors that they were already close to dominating. And they had to follow some of the same processes that I've outlined for T&G and ASTMS. They had to make sure that their local people were active. They should make sure that their local people were recruiting. And UP developed an organising method which was better than anything I've ever seen. One of the great tragedy of the unions and amalgamation is that organising model, which was doing such great work in recruiting people in the health service in particular, faded away. It was covered by the now-go bureaucracy. But nevertheless, even with that reservation, those three unions, following that particular practice, did very well. By contrast, we've got a few examples of unions with confused objectives and sometimes with a conflict between their objective and the structure that they had. UCAT wanted to be the main, perhaps only, building union. Right? If they're going to grow rapidly, they have to follow the same processes that I've described. But UCAT had a second and confusing objective. They wanted to maintain central control. They didn't want to spread out the power across the union. They wanted to hold it in the centre because they thought that was the best way to run a union. And it didn't work. They didn't develop the network of stewards and local representatives that they needed. One example in the book says that in all of the building sites in Birmingham, there were only 2 UCAT shop stewards. You can't build a union with rapid growth with those resources. They don't work. In similar fashion, and this might be a bit more controversial, the AUEW wanted to be the industrial union for the engineering industry, to dominate the industry. A great, I'm sure, wonderful objective, fully in line with the TUC advice, which at this time was pushing the idea of industrial unionism. There's, I'm afraid, another lost cause that was unravelled. But the trouble was that the AUEW shop stewards didn't quite see it the way that it was seen in the centre. They were very happy to recruit craftsmen, but they were not very happy to recruit semi-skilled and unskilled workers, and of course they were quite reluctant to recruit women. So a great block of the engineering workforce was effectively neglected by the AUEW. And they never really made up their mind as a central objective as to whether they wanted to be an industrial union in the engineering industry or they wanted to remain a craft union. And that contradiction damaged their efforts in a major way. There are other things with the AUEW. Those of you who know the AUEW of those days will know that there was what the book calls a two-party system. There was a well-organised left and there was a well-organised right. I'm not going to try and give bouquets for brutality, but there was quite a lot of brutality. And this battle took up an enormous amount of energy, and on occasions it took priority over everything else. Yeah, they wanted to be an industrial union, but on the other hand, they wanted, by hell, to win the next election in the union. And there were elections every year, sometimes twice a year. So it's a constant battle, a constant struggle, arm wrestling, a bit more brutal than arm wrestling sometimes. But that was the distraction. And it was an important distraction. So a confusion of objectives and a distraction as well. There are a lot of examples of unions with more modest ideas, more modest objectives. But they showed it could be successful providing they stuck to it. The NUM is a very good example. The NUM wanted to be a centralised union with a central negotiation. And they determined to do that in spite of the fact there was a great deal of opposition from some groups of members who were already benefiting more greatly than others through local agreements. The Post Office Engineering Union was a particular example. They wanted to sustain themselves as an effective bargaining unit, a strong bargaining unit that could get their own way. So when there was the opportunity to make a merger with the posties, they turned it down. Now this is a period where mergers, as I'll say in a moment, were becoming very important. But that didn't achieve their objective. It made their bargaining position weaker, not stronger. So they pushed it aside. During this period, as has been said, we had incomes policy, voluntary or statutory, almost permanently. Most unions saw this as a threat for obvious reasons, difficult to get decent pay rises against that background. But the better unions, particularly the better, bigger unions, saw it as an opportunity. If you're in an incomes policy, I speak from some experience in this area, since I'm old enough to remember it all, you had to be quite expert in designing your pay claims and in adjusting your settlements so that they fitted through all the little strange shapes that the government or the TUC designed for us. You had to put the right shape in the right hole, then you could get the money. If you didn't design it with great care, you didn't get the money. The big unions, some of them, saw the opportunity, they had the expertise, so they used it. And they then told the smaller unions, if you want some of this, you better join us. Mergers became very, very important during this period, as you know, and I think this is a great book. It was the forerunner of the great work that Roger did on mergers, and anybody in the trade union movement in a position of power ought to read the book and Roger Undy's work, because never mind the history, never mind how out of date it seems, this is the way mergers work, this is the way you successfully amalgamate. On the one hand, there were people who adjusted their unions so that the mergers were easier. After the '64 Act, it was easier to get mergers, so take the opportunity. Some did. Very interesting to see that ASTMS were merging with taking over, let's not be mealy-mouthed about it, 2 or 3 unions a year in this period. T&G were snaffling unions from other people's noses. They amalgamated with the plasterers, which of course the building unions thought was theirs. It wasn't. They then managed to amalgamate with the National Union of Vehicle Builders, which the engineers thought was theirs, but it wasn't. They then amalgamated with the chemical workers, which the GMW thought was ours, but it wasn't. If you adjusted your structure, you could make mergers so much easier. The last point I wanted to make is that during this period, there seemed to be a wide recognition, certainly it was on the ground, between the unions that were doing well and the unions were not doing so well. Inter-union rivalry got stiffer. There was a lot of pressure on the ones that were not doing very well, both in terms of pay claims and under the incomes policy and for other reasons, and the best in class. So there was pressure on union leadership, but there was also something more than that. There was pressure led by Jack Jones for greater involvement in decision making so that the members had a real participatory role. Now of course this was entirely in line with the T&G's method as well of course as the objective. But they took action and they put themselves in a position to win the mergers. But sometimes things have unintended consequences. If you tell the members they are the powerful ones, forget the executive, forget the conference, you are the powerful ones, they believe it, reasonably enough. And 2 examples from the T&G illustrate the complications of trade union reform. In 1969, the National Secretary of the T&G, called Les Keeley, spoke to his conference of Ford representatives, telling them that the offer made by Ford was a good one. They gave him a rather rude answer, so he had the decision either to go with his guts, which might well have been right, or to go with the conference delegates. He went with his guts. He wouldn't follow the conference result, their decision. Jack Jones went mad, and Les Keeley lost his job. Unintended consequences. In 1977, a few years later, Jack Jones was defeated at the T&G biennial delegate conference when he tried to explain to the delegates why he had agreed to extend the social contract with all its conditions and restrictions on pay negotiations without asking the members first. It's sometimes quite difficult being a General Secretary, I tell you. But things were changing in other directions. Nowgo and the NUT, after years of consideration, decided to affiliate to the TUC. Great, a big step forward. On the other hand, while things were certainly changing, as Peter and others have said, no one was expecting what was going to happen next in '79 and beyond. Thanks very much. I enjoyed the book. It was a great piece of work.
Thank you.
We're now going to have a discussion for anyone brave enough to debate with the 3 experts and me I should suggest you put the most difficult questions to me, because then we don't have, I won't be expected to answer them. At the back there. Someone was waiting.
Oh, right, I am at the back. I wasn't.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes, I had a. Well, first of all, thank you very much for all four of you for your presentations. I had a comment with you, or a question about agency. This comment you were making about agency. I mean, the other difference, the other thing that changed in 1979 is the nature of the labour market itself. And before that, you know, the labour force was largely in permanent full-time employment, a male workforce working in manufacturing, in stable factories. After that, gradually now, of course, we have a much more fragmented labour force, much more part-time work, many fixed-term contracts. The precariety of the labour market has become very much of a concern. And into that, you have the whole issue of human resource management, which has led also to the individualisation of employment practices to a large degree. Now, given that discrepancy between the two kinds, I'm not putting it very crudely, but those two states of the labour market, then surely a trade union that's wanting to grow would have had it easier before 1979 it would since. I mean, a union that now wants to grow in the same way is going to be confronted by a much more precarious labour force. People on fixed-term contracts, you've got the growth of the gig economy. All these factors have objectively made it more difficult for unions to recruit anyway. So that really was the point I wanted to ask about the relationship between union objectives on one hand and the objective labour market situation which they find themselves in on the other. Because the other thing, John, about, for example, UCAT, if you are recruiting in a factory with a relatively stable labour force that comes in every day, you know, work shifts and they're there all the time, a building site, by contrast, is a very different place to operate. You know, a building site starts off with the foundations of the building, then you have the walls and the roof, and each stage of the building process requires a different set of workers who come in, and then when that project is over, often quite quickly, that labour force disperses and they go on to other building sites. So there's a huge variation, turnaround, churn, if you like, of workers on building sites that you simply don't get in manufacturing industries. And I wonder whether for UCAT that would have been another issue. The nature of the labour force itself is continually changing. So what I'm saying in a word is that the nature of the labour force itself and the labour market is also a major factor in our understanding of agency.
Tony, would you have a go?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look back, I touched on about the context of the book being, well, the whole research project and subsequently the book. Obviously, we dealt with the timing. It was when it was. It was the years of what we've said. It's also that all the things that changed subsequently, because of this exquisite coincidence of the timing of all this, the book is a sort of, it's almost a memorial to an old way of doing industrial relations in the UK, but crucially on your point, it reflects an old labour market. I'm absolutely 100% right, and because it does cover labour market issues, the book, and looks at how they impact, but it doesn't do it in the context of hindsight being the wonderful thing it is, what we know happened in the 80s and 90s and beyond. And so there's no question whatsoever that the even more than in the period covered by the book, the changes in the labour market in the decades after 1980 are absolutely fundamental in what happened to the British trade union movement. In headline numbers we've heard, you know, 13 million trade unions in 1979, the peak for probably all time. Now half of that, less than half, 6 million, something, whatever it is, and so on. All that, absolutely right. And so, well, I should also remind people of the obvious, which, I mean, I've been out of this area of work for more, ever since I stopped working at the TUC, basically, 40 years ago. So I don't claim any expertise to answer the point you've made, other than hopefully a closely interested observer of what's going on. But I can see what everyone can see, that the labour market issues are, you could argue, are probably more predominant now than they were in the period of the book. So if you're talking about a balance between how much is internal, how much do the unions, to use the word, how much union leaders have agency and how much don't they, there's a nice area of debate to say that maybe they have less agency now than they did in the period of the study, that the labour markets have more power, and things like that. I think there's quite a lot of scope for that sort of discussion, which leads to my final point, which is that, which I should have said earlier on, but it's obvious, if anyone know either themselves or knows someone who's there in the teaching arena, knows a student who wants to do a PhD thesis on the 2023 version of this book, great, bring it on.
Next one. Yes, please.
Yes, how much was it the small conservative, or conservative with a small c, of the General Secretaries, which was the, in a sense, the hindrance to them being able to adapt to the change of 1979? My experience is that I used to work for a trade union, Usdaw, in this period during the mid-70s, and that union was particularly, I regard as being quite conservative, in that as a worker for the union, I wasn't allowed to join the ASTMS because Clive Jenkins' union came in and tried to recruit the workers of Usdaw, and the General Secretary put a block on it and said, "You're more than happy to be working here, and we are a union. We'll look after you." And they pushed ASTMS away and threatened to. I think the seat on the General Council was at risk at that point for Clive Jenkins, and I think that there were threats being made to him at that point for him to move away. Conspiracy theories.
The subject of trade unions and their own employees and their own industrial relations is another book.
Well, there are several union. Well, I was a union official, and we were in the GMB, I think. I think yes. I mean, several GMB organised in unions, the TNG organised in unions, ASTMS organised in unions. The ASTMS particularly, I mean, there was this phrase about Clive Jenkins, if it moves, recruit it. And you know, they were quite, promiscuous, yes, I mean, they would go anywhere. Never mind if they could service the members they were getting, but I mean, that was they and the TNG were really going for growth. And there were quite a lot of complaints that the service afterwards was not necessarily very good, and of course they left.
But were they resistant to change because of and therefore the disaster that happened in 1979 with the Thatcher government and the anti-union legislation that followed that? Were they not prepared for that? Were they not ready for that sort of change?
Well, my union recruited an awful lot of people who work for other trade unions. And I'm reluctant to say, but it is the truth, that we found many of the leaderships in those unions to be just as narrow-minded, idiotic, undemocratic as many people in the private sector. You know, the idea that when you become a trade union official or you become a general secretary, all the rooms around you open and out comes liberal democracy is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration. And we had tremendous trouble with Usdaw when we tried to recruit there as well. But the great thing is now I'm retired, I can say these things. Immediately behind you there was a question.
I'm sorry, I mean, mine was in large part a reiteration of the first one. Just, I mean, in the sort of sharpest terms, you know, the NUM has disappeared because there's no mining industry. The RCN has risen, as Valerie said, to the fourth largest because the NHS is the largest employer in Britain. I mean, I don't think it's all about precarity, but clearly it's about the changing labour market. But I mean, even if you take the AUEW, I mean, even if it had adopted a much more progressive stance than the one that you were rightly outlining, if it had been willing to recruit women, if it had been willing to recruit the unskilled and the less skilled, it would still have largely disappeared because engineering employment has largely disappeared. So I just wanted to, excuse me, re-emphasise that point, that this is a story very much about a particular period in post-war history. If you take the long view of trade union development, I think you have to downplay the agency issue. Much more of it, I'm not saying there's no agency, but much more of it is about the changing structure of the labour market.
There's a question there.
Yeah, I mean, I think someone once told me, I think when I was doing research, that between 79 and 81, a quarter of manufacturing disappeared. So that was a pretty dramatic change in the labour market in that sense. I suppose one of the things that interests me about the book, which is symptomatic of British industrial relations at that time, perhaps with the exception of Clegg's book on collective bargaining, is that there's virtually no comparative approach. There's no looking across to see what's happening in Northern Europe.
Or America, or whatever.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose in the sense the Fording Productivity Agreement is sort of borrowing from America, but there's virtually none looking at Northern Europe. And there were similar trends in Northern Europe. There's a book by, is it Crouch and Pizarro or something, on strikes, and there was similar trends, but somehow in Northern Europe they overcame this, the trade unions overcame this, and consolidated in the 1980s. And I think that's an interesting question. I suppose one of the thoughts comes to me is that there's a lot of talk about trade union strategy, but there's no sense of an overall trade union strategy. You know, because so what you get in places like Sweden and Germany is solidaristic bargaining across the whole of industry, and that solidifies trade unionism. Whereas I think John's been too nice to T&G. I mean, that strategy of decentralised bargaining and stuff is one of the things that I think probably destroys the British trade unions in the end, because you destroy national bargaining, you decentralise everything, and then you can't have any overall strategy in a sense.
Yes, Donovan was wrong, actually. Donovan was very helpful during periods of optimism and growth. A strong manufacturing sector, big companies, big workplaces. But when times change, all of those structures, the collective bargaining structures, the National Joint Industrial Councils, all of that, Whitley Councils, all of those, we'd wave them happily goodbye. Trade unions were very happy with the outcome of the Donovan Commission, because at that time, by and large, you did better with decentralised bargaining, you did better by going through shop stewards and going through national officers. But of course, when times change, and we were on the defensive rather than having the opportunity to be aggressive, the structures that might perhaps have provided the scaffolding to keep us upright, they've gone. And we'd waved them bye-bye. And that was short-sightedness of a major degree. Almost everybody that's been mentioned, mind, agreed with the Donovan Commission, and it was only much later that we all realised, as so often happens, what we'd lost.
There's questions over there and over there.
Over, yes please.
I wouldn't dare debate with, as you put it, with any of the four distinguished speakers, but I do have a couple of questions. I'll just preface it by saying about Peter Ackers' comment that it was a great time for industrial relations academics. It was also a great time for labour journalists and strikes. And unlike for industrial relations academics, the end of strikes was terminal for labour correspondents. Just really two questions, if I may. John, you answered most of my questions about mergers, which I think were being very important. But I just wanted to ask you, and I suppose it relates very slightly to what Peter Ackers was saying about a more solidaristic approach to bargaining. I mean, looked back from now, and after all, mergers have continued long after the period of this book, I think yours is probably the only big union which retains the main elements of its original name. Whether, looking back on it through the sweep of history, it was really so great, and whether we all used to say, you know, there are far too many unions, but actually not necessarily the fact that these mergers happened, and as Valerie Ellis said, the number of unions reduced so dramatically, but the way in which it happened. I mean, did it, for example, as an engine for growth, did mergers stop what now seems a much more topical issue than it did then, the urge to recruit in ununionized sectors? If you could grow your union by merger, you sort of didn't have to do that so much. And just somebody to comment on that, and the other one, which I suspect you'll regard as a pointlessly counterfactual question, which is on in place of strife, which, as Peter Ackers was saying, Bill McCarthy contributed to in a major way. It was obviously a lost opportunity for Barbara Castle and Harold Rawson. Was it, looking back, also a lost opportunity for the unions?
Well, thank you, Don. Nice, easy questions. The merger one, I'm happier to deal with than the other one. The merger one, unfortunately, and I mentioned this already in respect of UP, almost every merger brought with it losses. I don't mean losses of members, I mean losses of skills, losses of identity, sometimes losses of a feeling of collective endeavour. What we did with the whole merger period, we managed to, I don't know, perhaps just sanitize the trade union movement and also to make it more uniform. And the UP organising model, which was great, we should have just copied it, not done anything more. Or on the other hand, a system that happened in many of the craft unions, where it was the craft that was holding people together. The rate of service might have been rubbish, and I had some personal experience of that when we amalgamated with the Boilermakers. But the fact that they had an identity, and if it was a craft identity, it was an identity plus, kept them committed to the trade union movement. And we've got rid of a lot of that. And the feeling which Val was touching on, that you could belong to any union, it doesn't matter very much, because they're all more or less the same. That actually doesn't mean a vibrant trade union movement with success and otherwise. As far as, yeah, there were plenty of things we could have done better in place of strife. Donovan, not just that, we had the opportunity of having workers on the board. We had a lot of opportunities which we managed to let drop through our fingers. One of them, I mean, the workers on the board, I deliberately campaigned against. I must have been mad, probably was. But we had those opportunities, but of course it was against the background of optimism. We didn't need these crutches and supports, so why bother with them? You know.
Well, I think, I mean, one of the key sort of philosophies of the trade union movement in Britain has been voluntarism and not to rely on the state, and in fact to keep the state out as far as you possibly could, because they thought that they could get much further by collective bargaining or by organising their own areas. And this probably is partly a result of the way the trade union movement in Britain grew, which was very higgledy-piggledy, it wasn't particularly designed to. Whereas in Germany, for example, after the Second World War, trade union movement was sort of set up by advisors from the TUC and so forth in a beautiful, yes, industrial union way. Not that I necessarily agree with industrial unions, there's obviously debate about occupational and industrial as sort of models. But in Britain, they just grew, well, they gradually grew. I mean, the craft unions first, and they had their own model, and then the general trade unions through beginning with TAG and GNO. And so nobody ever got a grip on what was a sensible way to organise, and also there was this complete philosophy about keep the law out. You know, we do better without the law, and they did a lot of, I think.
There's also the irony that the mergers didn't simplify trade union structure. They further complicated it. And as John was saying, there were some of the mergers, they should have taken place in different directions, which would have created some sort of industrial logic. But it was, so you created some, I mean, it's like Unite. I once in an article sort of looked at Unite and broke it down a little bit. And it might be called Unite, but it's just it's a holding operation for a load of separate groups that negotiate in different ways. There's nothing really uniting it in a sense. And that seems to be unfortunate when you look at some of the continental unions that have got more coherence. You know.
I mean, sorry, I'll take the question.
Can I just go back to this issue about agency in trade unions? It strikes me, my memory of the book, and I haven't read it in a long time, is that in part the agency is stronger on internal union issues. If you want to reorganise the union, if you want to decide to embark on a strategy of growth, consolidation within a particular sector, or you want to merge and enter into new sectors, you can do it. What's interesting though is the limits of that agency, even in the 60s, 70s. If you look at that graph up there from Marsh, to a large extent, trade union membership is tracking the growth in employment. Over half the labour force basically remained outside the trade unions even at that point. The unions didn't have the agency which said we can recruit in the service sectors in particular for all the kind of issues that have been flagged, right? Much smaller establishments, much more fragmented, much higher rates of labour turnover, much harder to recruit. The other point I'd make about agency is there was more than one actor in this. And the trade unions and the decentralised structure and the increasingly fragmented collective bargaining provoked other agencies, not least the Conservative Party. Having been wrecked on the 71 Industrial Relations Act, they didn't sit back and think, this is okay. What they actually did was they rethought how they could actually change this. And the legislation they introduced in 81 was significantly and profoundly different. They exercised their agency with a much greater strategic intent than the unions had done, partly because I think the unions never really had an overarching strategy other than grow. That wasn't quite the same thing. Employers, we haven't talked about employers. Employers in a way watched the destruction of national bargaining because they thought they might benefit from its fragmentation. And in a way they did, because when the trade unions were weakened, then it became a significant shift of power towards management. Their agency increased. And I don't think you can use the agency theory without thinking about the other big actors. And in that sense, the trade unions were only one actor in this. It doesn't make them an agent with unilateral power, it makes them an agent with fairly circumscribed power.
I agree with that.
I do too. I say that the context of the book and the time it was written, and the time the research was done, was to say, compared particularly to the other academic research at the time, which was being referred to, was that there was more agency than people had said. That was the issue. There's no suggestion in the book. I've just, as I said, reread it last few weeks in advance of today, so it's very fresh. in that sense. There's no suggestion that all these points you've made aren't absolutely valid. So I think it's a question of how one interprets it, but I think that's absolutely right. But just to remain on the earlier point, I think there are examples in the book, and time mentions getting into detail, which make the point that Tom referred to, namely, mergers are much easier, and not just easier in terms of effort, but financial resources. But the financial resources of the individual unions is a much bigger issue, which I sort of undercurrent that I picked up, which maybe we didn't flush out enough. I mean, there was all the tables and figures, which of course there are massive numbers, you know, we've read it. There's nothing about the financial circumstances of the unions, which probably there should have been, because I think that was a driver as well, for obvious reasons. So I just wanted to add that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. I mean, I think probably one of the sort of myths in the trade union movement was the sort of myth of pure voluntarism. You know, we did it ourselves. We sort of, you know, we got membership by campaigning and stuff like that, whereas right through the 20th century, from the late 19th century, employers were big players, and employers basically were once they saw trade unions were on the horizon, most large employers started to proactively recognise trade unions. And then the state, particularly after the First World War, played a very active role in encouraging trade union recognition. And I think, you know, but I mean, I've argued somewhere, by the time you get to the late 70s, really the trade union power doesn't just rest on their own strengths alone, it rests on public opinion, the attitude of the state and both political parties, the attitude of employers, the attitude of employees. And if they start to lose any of those people, they're in trouble, really. And I think that's something that wasn't recognised enough at the time, that actually it was the whole social context that was underpinning trade union power. I mean, for instance, the extent of the closed shop was a very important aspect of trade union power at that time. And so once they lose that soft power, things become more difficult.
Okay, well, no one's conveniently holding their hand up because we've reached, as Tony has just reminded me, beyond the point of no return. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the authors of the book for providing something which was, well, for me, a great new read. Unfortunately, I knew almost all of the people mentioned in the book. In many cases, I wish I'd known their sons and daughters more than I knew them, but that's life. But thank you all for coming, and I think this is a considerable tribute, and as has already been suggested, let's in a moment remember Roger and Bill, who I'm sure would have contributed to great extent and very well to this particular discussion. But thank you, Valerie and Tony, for organising it. Very grateful. Thanks very much, guys.